Good evening. I'm Robert Newman. I'm the president and director of the National Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second event in our annual public lecture series. Just on a brief personal note, when I was 16 years old, I read Richard Ellmann's biography of James Joyce, which is the greatest literary biography of the 20th century, and it propelled me eventually into Joyce studies. So tonight's speaker has a special place in my heart. And of course, Maud has become a very prominent, prestigious, and influential scholar in her own right. Maud Ellmann received her PhD in English from St. Anne's College, Oxford in 1981, and she began her career at the University of Southampton, where she spent the first decade of her career. In 1990, she moved to the University of Cambridge, where she was made a Fellow of King's College, and in 2005, she moved to the United States to take up the position of the Donald and Marilyn Keogh Professor of Irish Studies and also endowed Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, depending. Since 2010, she has been the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Professor of the Development of the Novel in English at the University of Chicago. Professor Ellmann serves on the editorial boards of the Oxford Literary Review, the James Joyce Quarterly, Joyce Studies Annual, Critical Quarterly, Irish University Review, Modern Philology, and the journal MF. She's also the general editor for a new monograph series on mid-century modern writing for Edinburgh University Press. Professor Ellmann's work has been lauded for its subtlety and depth, and for its contributions to our understanding of how the work of writers from Elizabeth Bowen and Bram Stoker to Graham Greene and George Orwell reflect back to us the dramatic changes taking place at the turn of the 20th century and in the turbulent decades that followed. Her first monograph, The Poetics of Impersonality, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, with its brilliant readings of these two seminal poetic figures in the modernist canon, has been described as one of the most important critical works on Eliot and Pound in the past several decades. Chapters excerpted from the book have been included in a number of Eliot anthologies and critical editions, and the entire volume was republished by Edinburgh University Press in 2013. Professor Ellmann's subsequent writings have only increased her reputation as one of the foremost scholars of modernist literature in the world. She's received numerous honors, awards, and fellowships in recognition of her work. Among these, she's been elected a founding fellow of the English Association and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and received research fellowships from ACLS, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and on more than one occasion, the National Humanities Center. In 2007-2008, Maud Ellmann spent a year as a fellow here at the center as she worked on her prize-winning volume, The Nets of Modernism, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Sigmund Freud, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. Once again this year, she's in residence at the center as the M.H. Abrams Fellow, working on a project examining fiction and psychoanalysis in World War II. She's generously agreed to share some of the aspects of that work with us this evening in her talk, Vaccies Go Home, Evacuation, Psychoanalysis, and Fiction in World War II Britain. Please welcome Professor Maud Ellmann.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Robert for that incredibly generous introduction, which I don't have a chance of living up to, but thank you. And before I get started, I'd like to thank the staff and all my fellow fellows at the National Humanities Center for providing such a wonderful environment for my work. I'd particularly like to thank the librarians because I've kept them very busy. And the rich materials they've provided have caused me to rethink a lot of what I'm going to say today. So this lecture will be somewhat open-ended. I haven't come to any firm conclusions, but I look forward to hearing your ideas in the discussion. On September 1st, 1939, the day Hitler's troops invaded Poland, the British government launched a program ominously codenamed Operation Pied Piper, whereby millions of children, together with their mothers, were to be evacuated from the cities to the countryside. Out of the expected 3 million evacuees, however, less than half that number actually showed up at the railway stations. This is because many parents who had signed up their children during the Munich crisis had changed their minds in the intervening year. But instead of easing the pressure on transportation, this low turnout threw the system into disarray. Many trains were canceled, while those that ran were overcrowded, frequently delayed, and ill-equipped with lavatories. Herded into the carriages, the children were whisked off to unknown destinations and offloaded onto railway platforms, where the most appealing would be cherry-picked by local hosts. As one evacuated schoolteacher remembered, the scene which ensued was more akin to a cattle or slave market than anything else. The prospective foster mothers just invaded us and walked about the field, picking out what they considered to be the most presentable specimens. The children that felt they were going to be left behind dissolved in tears. Some evacuees returned home within days. Others trickled back over the 7 months before the bombing raids began in the period that came to be known as the Phony War, or as Evelyn Waugh puts it, the Great Boer War. So in this talk, I want to examine the impact of evacuation on fiction and psychoanalysis in World War II Britain. I'll begin with the evacuees themselves, whose stories bring class conflict into the foreground, revealing drastic divisions between rich and poor, between the country and the city. These divisions also loom large in the fiction of the period, including Evelyn Waugh's satirical novel, Put Out More Flags, and Joyce Carey's Charlie is My Darling, which I'll be discussing in the first part of the talk. In the second part, I want to investigate the impact of evacuation on the development of British psychoanalysis, in which the infant psyche came to be regarded as a war inside, to borrow the title of a recent book on this subject. My talk will focus on Melanie Klein's case history of a 10-year-old evacuee in her monumental Narrative of a Child analysis, which is arguably the longest case history in the psychoanalytic repertoire, though I promise not to give the longest lecture on it. And I'll conclude by looking at a post-war short story called A Sad Garden by Elizabeth Taylor. Now, this is the other Elizabeth Taylor, not the actress, but the novelist. This story uses the figure of the child to explore the traumatic aftermath of World War II. This is the story on your handouts. So, to begin with the evacuees' accounts of their experience, Jimmy Benton, who was evacuated with his siblings to Stafford during World War II, later remembered the locals' cool reception. As evacuees in Stafford, my brothers, sisters, and I knew we were unwelcome. We came from Margate, and our southern accents marked us as strangers. I remember seeing "Vaccies go home" scrawled on the side of a static water tank. I added, "We want to." Soon Jimmy was able to make friends with a local boy, which shielded him from some of this hostility. But his sister, Mary Rose, was less fortunate. Billeted with a family that expected city children to be scruffy, louse-ridden, and out of control, Mary Rose disappointed her hosts with her quiet good manners and was subjected to a violent beating for her efforts. Her case was not unusual. An estimated 9 or 10% of young evacuees were physically or psychologically abused by their foster families. Though I think you have to remember that this kind of maltreatment was scarcely unusual in a country with a long-standing tradition of corporal punishment for children. Even today, Britain is one of only 4 countries in the EU where smacking children is still legal. Maybe this is why they want to leave the EU. Anyway, during World War II, as one historian has pointed out, the myth of British wartime solidarity seemed to evaporate the first time a dirty evacuee soiled the sheets or failed to display middle-class table manners. But even clean evacuees like Mary Rose Benton, as we've seen, were liable to be punished for failing to conform to stereotype. Well, that nasty graffiti, Vaccies go home, as anyone who lived in Britain in the 1970s or 80s knows, it rhymes ominously with Pakis go home, which is a common jibe against Pakistani immigrants in that period. It's not just the syllables that rhyme, though, but the prejudice. Evidently, you don't have to cross a national boundary to be stigmatized as a stranger and intruder. Nor is this xenophobia softened by pity for the innocents. In World War II, sentimentality about children, even British children, was swept away by the fear of being overrun, which is a trope that still reverberates in racist rhetoric today. In the eyes of their Staffordshire hosts, evacuees were not only infested with vermin, they were vermin, just as Jews and gypsies were branded as vermin by the Nazis. Hence, Mary Rose Benton's foster family taunted her with stories about city children sleeping in their boots out of the fear that rats would bite their toes. This behavior demonstrated both their filthy habits, boots in bed, and their habitual proximity to vermin. Well, these myths and slanders suggest that Vaccies came to represent the repressed underside of British civilization. Undoubtedly, some urban children were filthy, ragged, ill-fed, foul-mouthed, delinquent, lousy, and incontinent, but far more were dragooned into the stereotype. Arriving en masse in the countryside, these children forced their rural and suburban hosts to face up to the desperate conditions of the urban slums, formerly masked by denial or indifference. In this context, the British tradition of moralizing at the poor came to the rescue of the disconcerted country gentry, who were quick to condemn these bedwetting urchins as products of poor training and loose morals, rather than victims of social injustice. Amidst all this finger-wagging, psychoanalysis did evacuees a great kindness by attributing bedwetting to separation anxiety rather than depravity. While this diagnosis seems obvious today, it came as a surprise in a culture where the customary remedy for bedwetting was to cane or beat offenders with a leather strap, to rub their faces in wet sheets, or force them to scrub pajamas and bed linen as a punishment. There was even a report of a Liverpool child chained up outside a dog kennel all night to cure her of the so-called vice. Under this regime, it's no wonder that some children became chronically incontinent. But it's also worth noting that the alleged epidemic of bedwetting dramatically subsided when the government withdrew its weekly subsidy for extra laundry. Well, these phobias about evacuees are brilliantly parodied by Yves Lemoine in his comic masterpiece, Put Out More Flags, of 1942. In this novel, Barbara Sothill, who's the sister of Waugh's lovable rogue Basil Seal and mistress of an idyllic country estate at Malfrey, finds herself in charge of billeting arrangements for 50 families evacuated from Birmingham. Among these refugees are the three incorrigible Connolly orphans, one leering, one lowering, one drooling. The leering one is Doris Connolly, an overripe nymphomaniac who's billeted with her atrocious siblings to a local farming family, where she terrorizes the male members of the household with relentless lascivious advances. Mickey, described as her junior by the length of a rather stiff sentence for housebreaking, is a scrawny, scowling, foul-mouthed gutter snipe who decapitates the farmer's family cat, along with half a dozen unfortunate ducks. The third child, Marlene, is an imbecile with a taste for dog food and a chronic tendency to sick it up. She's a dirty girl, begging your pardon, Mum, the beleaguered farmer grumbles. It's not only her wetting the bed, she wetted everywhere, chairs, floor, and not only wetting, Mum. Never seemed to have been taught in a house where she comes from. Basil Seal, who's fresh from his cannibal escapade in Waugh's 1932 novel, Black Mischief, and who's always on the lookout for a scam, pounces on these monstrous children as a chance for an easy buck, or an easy guinea, to be precise. Masquerading as a billeting officer, he unloads the Connollys onto one unlucky household after another, where the children proceed to demolish the premises, thus enabling Basil to extort huge bribes from the homeowners to remove the vandals from the wreckage. Well, in contrast to Waugh's slapstick satire, Joyce Carey's 1940 novel, Charlie Is My Darling, takes a compassionate view of London Vaccies. He uses this term too. Vaccies relocated to the West Country, although these children turn out to be even more destructive than the Connollys. The title derives from a Scottish folk song adapted by Robert Burns about Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rebellion, which evokes ideas of exile and defeat that resonate in Carey's novel. Carey's anti-hero, Charlie Brown, also owes something to the teenage gangster Pinky Brown in Graham Greene's recently published bestseller, Brighton Rock, as well as something to William Brown, who's the naughty 11-year-old hero of Richmal Crompton's popular children's series, the Just William books, as you see. One of them is about evacuation. Anyway, Carey's novel opens in 1939 when 14-year-old Charlie and his stepmother are evacuated from London to the tiny hamlet of Brolswood in the West Country. Here they're billeted with Mrs. Parr, a stern country wife who's appalled by Mrs. Brown's indulgence towards her stepson. Easygoing Mrs. Brown, who's absorbed in her new baby, spends most of her time gossiping with other evacuated Cockney mothers in the pub. And she intervenes in Charlie's upbringing only, quote, to warn him against all persons who wished in any way to control him and interfere with his freedom of action. So with a guardian like Mrs. Brown, Charlie has little chance of staying out of trouble. At the beginning of the novel, though, his fate hangs in the balance. Charming, imaginative, and gifted in drawing, Charlie could become an artist or a criminal. In the event, delinquency wins out. After his humiliating arrival in the village, when Charlie has to be deloused, his head shaven, and his clothing burnt, he quickly makes off for lost prestige by becoming the ringleader of a gang of London Vaccies, who are wowed by his daredevil schemes and his bullish courage in carrying them out. A local girl called Lizzie, who's hard of hearing and backward in school, grows attached to Charlie, who showers her with stolen gifts. One night when a bully pushes Charlie into a freezing pond, Lizzie comes to the rescue and sneaks him into her family home, thereby risking a beating from her father, who's forbidden her to socialize with Vaccies. During the night, the shivering children find warmth and comfort in each other's arms, too innocent to take precautions against pregnancy. At the end of the novel, Charlie is arraigned by the police for a series of break-ins that culminated in the drunken smash-up of a country home where the gang vandalized a valuable art collection. Severely castigated for Lizzie's pregnancy, of which he's wholly unaware, Charlie is unable to account for either his criminal or sexual misdeeds. As Carey writes, Charlie, blind, deaf, and senseless, not knowing what is happening to him, steps down into the glittering dark. The teenage lovers make a last desperate bid to run away together to America, as they call it, but they're intercepted by the authorities. Forcibly separated, Charlie's dispatched to a remand home, and Lizzie to, quote, one of those rescue homes where she'll be looked after proper and taught the laundry, as a local observer moralizes. Well, this plot summary conveys little of the flavor of the novel, which is written in an urgent present tense and consists largely of Cockney dialogue between the youngsters, which is counterpointed by the locals' West Country idiom. The story then is told almost entirely from the children's point of view, so we're immersed in the wayward but inexorable logic of their subculture. Particularly disturbing is the children's painful inarticulacy and bewilderment. Questioned by a billeting officer who's befriended him, Charlie admits that he liked the paintings he attacked and can't understand his own destructiveness. Only his drunkenness provides a ready-made, if unconvincing, explanation. What he can't express is the aesthetic excitement of iconoclasm. A bottle flies through the portrait, another through the Constable landscape beside it. Charlie sees what can be done with pictures, expensive pictures, to produce a definite and glorious sensation. Just as definite and glorious, in fact, as his earlier sensation of creative power when he drew a bull of blue fire with transparent horns full of flame. What Carey shows here is that the impulse to create is closely akin to the impulse to destroy. The imaginative spark that finds expression in Charlie's artwork also fuels his acts of violence. This intuition is in tune with contemporary psychoanalytic studies of childhood aggression. At this time, psychoanalysts sought to understand the psychic etiology of war, to understand, that is, how the war inside explodes into the war outside. Carey's evacuated youngsters seem to be demonically possessed by the war from which they're supposedly removed. Their orgies of vandalism pre-enact the devastation of the Blitz. The novel also hints at allegory in that the skirmishes between the children, their shady pacts and wanton betrayals, anticipate in miniature the military politics of World War II. In different ways, then, both Waugh and Carey portray the evacuation program as a fiasco, where the importation of unruly city children into the countryside produces mayhem. Outside fiction, however, the results of this colossal social experiment were much more mixed. Evacuees were often blamed for a juvenile crime wave that actually had more to do with wartime disruption of school and family routine. Besides, the school leaving age at this time was 14, exactly Charlie's age in Carey's novel, which accounts at least in part for the high incidence of crime among bored children of this age group. Even so, juvenile delinquents were a minority among evacuees. Many of these urban children, far from turning to crime, enjoyed the much-touted benefits of country life. Other youngsters, however, found the country dull. Defying the idealization of the English countryside in contemporary nationalist propaganda, these children missed the smog and noise of city life. In the Cambridge Evacuation Survey of 1941, edited by psychoanalyst Susan Isaacs, one youngster who's been relocated to Cambridge from the working-class district of Tottenham in London makes this complaint. "What I miss most in Cambridge is the thick fogs and fish and chips." Another evacuee misses the buses and heavy lorries which go past my house at home. And a further child misses the thunder of the tube. An orthographically challenged 8-year-old misses his tortoise, a distinctly unbucolic pet whose oral sadism may reflect his owner's Kleinian fantasies. He says, "I miss my tortoise in London. He is Robert Taylor. He bit me once, he bit me, and I told him he was a naughty boy, and I fed him lots of times." This devouring tortoise presumably owes his name to Robert Taylor, one of the leading Hollywood actors of the day, who'd recently starred in hits like Waterloo Bridge in 1940. Susan Isaacs in Cambridge was one of many psychoanalysts who worked with young evacuees and refugees during the war. Others included John Bowlby, Donald Winnicott, and Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who teamed up with Dorothy Burlington to establish the Hampstead Therapy Clinic for Infants Without Families, to borrow the title of their joint report. Anna Freud's arch-rival, Melanie Klein, took refuge from the London air raids, as well as from the turf wars in the British Psychoanalytical Society, by relocating to Pitlochry, Scotland, where she conducted her 4-month analysis of a 10-year-old boy. Scattered across the island, these analysts and their evacuated patients fostered the development of a distinctively British form of psychoanalysis based on closely observed children, a technique that adapted Freudian thought, which was, after all, a continental import to British empirical traditions. Despite the quarrels between these rival schools, though, this new generation of psychoanalysts was united in its concern about the role of aggression in a democratic society, a current concern I think that you can also see in Carey's novel. If the infant is a Hitler in the making, as Kleinian theory implies, how can its paranoid and schizoid impulses be redirected for the common good? The psychoanalyst Edward Glover, when he was addressing women magistrates at Oxford on the subject of juvenile crime, insisted that babies were innately egocentric, greedy, dirty, violent in temper, destructive in habit, and profoundly sexual in purpose. Judged by adult standards, Glover claimed, the normal baby is for all practical purposes a born criminal. One of these female magistrates protested, "But doctor, the dear babies, how could you say such awful things about them?" Also outraged for different reasons was Lord Olivier, a Fabian socialist, who objected to Glover's psychoanalytic explanation of stealing on the grounds that, quote, the motivation for offenses against property is economic, not psychopathic. So just as psychoanalysts tended to downplay the objective strains of war in accounting for anxiety, which they attributed to the resurgence of infantile fantasies, so they disregarded economic inequality in seeking out unconscious motives for delinquency. In her narrative of a child analysis, Melanie Klein doggedly converts the objective circumstances of the war into her patient's Oedipal psychodrama. This patient, known as Richard, a 10-year-old evacuee from London, arrives in Pitlochry with symptoms of anxiety, depression, and hypochondria, compounded by a phobia towards other children, which prevents him from going to school. Obsessed with the war news, Richard reads 3 newspapers a day and closely follows the latest updates on the radio. He was particularly frightened of air raids and bombs, Klein reports, as if this were a neurotic symptom. Actually, Richard had good reason to be anxious about air raids, considering that his family home in London had been bombed to pieces, a fact that Klein omits from her account. This is a telling omission, given her methodology in this case history, which has been described as her most aggressive act of vaporizing context from her analytic work. Substituted for this external context is Richard's alleged inner world, peopled by the introjected doubles of his family circle: mother, father, brother, dog, grandmother, and other cameo performers. This inner world is also a war zone, judging by Richard's 74 extraordinary drawings that form the centerpiece of this case history. According to Klein's interpretations, Richard's drawings of submarines stand for the maternal body, torpedoed by the Hitler penis, or besieged by swarms of toothy starfish that represent rapacious babies. Well, these interpretations are themselves rapacious in that they demonstrate the capacity of psychoanalysis to swallow the landscape of war into its own interior. The whole arsenal of war, along with every feature of the analytic setting, a musty playroom in Pitlochry Town Hall, which is decorated with maps and sentimental photographs of pets and wildlife, and commands an enchanting view of Scottish countryside. All this is corralled into Klein's theory of internal objects warring in the mind. While the playroom represents, quote, the inside of the mother's body and its population, the gorgeous countryside, which Richard often pauses to admire, stands for the restoration of the mother's body after the injuries inflicted on it by vengeful penises and greedy babies. World leaders are also enlisted into this morality play, with Churchill, the good father, pitched against Hitler, the bad father, along with their respective allies and betrayers, Matsuoka, Darlan, Goebbels, Ribbentrop. Meanwhile, huge, voracious Germany, like a monstrous Kleinian baby, threatens to devour all the smaller nations of Europe, which are personified by Richard as lonely Romania, little Latvia, and brave little Switzerland. So in Richard's fantasies, nations become infants without families, persecuted or forsaken by their guardians. But it's interesting that persons also become nations. Mrs. Klein comes to stand for Austria, her native land, which has been invaded by the Austrian Hitler and engorged into his greedy empire. For Richard, the Anschluss implies that the good Austria has been occupied by the bad Austria, that is, by the murderous Hitler penis that can't be attacked without destroying its maternal container. So this is the war inside that Klein extrapolates from Richard's drawings, as well as from her observation of his play activities. As Klein writes in her characteristically contorted prose, if the feeling that war is really going on inside, that an internal Hitler is fought inside by a Hitler-like subject, predominates, then despair results. It is impossible to fight this war because in the internal situation, catastrophe is bound to be the end of it. So for Klein, the child is always in a blitz, bombarded by avenging internal objects and fighting back with fusillades of excrement. In this way, the child provides wartime psychoanalysis with a model of a situation in which the world is unmanageable. British wartime fiction is equally fascinated by the child mind, as we've seen, I think, in Carey's novel. Charlie in that novel does resemble the Kleinian infant, besieged by its own sadistic impulses. The novelist P.H. Newby, interesting figure in that he's entirely disappeared. Has anybody in this room heard of P.H. Newby? But he was the first winner of the Booker Prize. There's a lesson to be learned from that. Anyway, in his 1950 study of post-war British fiction of the past 5 years, since 1945, he notes the prevalence of children in this writing. He speculates that fiction writers, still bewildered by the recent experience of war, find in the minds of children a curiously similar bewilderment. Whereas 19th century writers thought of childhood as suitable material for the opening chapters of long biographical novels, like Dickens's Great Expectations, today, he says, the depicting of childhood has become an artistic end in itself, thus transforming early life into a symbol of existence at large. Now, according to Newby, much of this fiction sentimentalizes innocence, but this is not the case in Elizabeth Taylor and other writers such as Sylvia Townsend Warner, who show that childish innocence can often prove more toxic than experience. As Graham Greene puts it in The Quiet American, innocence always calls mutely for protection when we would be so much wiser to guard ourselves against it. Innocence is like a dumb leper who has lost his bell, wandering the world, meaning no harm. Before I get to Taylor and Warner, though, I'd like to think about the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who wrote an important study of childhood aggressivity during the war called Primitive Emotional Development. In this study, Winnicott notes a significant change in infants' behavior with objects between the ages of 5 and 6 months. Whereas many 5 months infants grasp an object and put it to the mouth, it is not until 6 months that the average infant starts to follow this up by deliberately dropping the object as part of his play with it. Well, this play with objects resembles the well-known Fort Da game that Freud analyzes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which was published just after World War I. And it's here that he proposes his controversial theory of the death drive. In the game that he observes, a little boy, who's actually his own grandson, throws a spool out of his cot, crying, "Oh," and then pulls it back with a cry of "ah." Freud interprets this spool game as the child's strategy for controlling his mother's presence and absence. He throws her away and then yanks her back. And the two vowels, O and A, are understood by Freud as rudimentary versions of the German words fort, meaning gone, and da, meaning there. Freud claims, I think wishful thinking, that more pleasure is attached to the second act, the restoration of the object, than to the first sadistic act of expulsion. But he admits that, as a rule, one only witnessed the first act, which was repeated untiringly as a game in itself. It seems to be a form of compulsion, compulsive repetition, masturbatory. But at any rate, it's the throwing away that seems to be most important to the child. Whatever the satisfactions of restoration, it's clear that little Ernst is more addicted to throwing things away and down. Why down? Well, Dropping the object might be seen as the infant's first bomb, its first projectile cast down from above. According to Winnicott, this game of dropping objects indicates the infant's knowledge that he has an inside and that things come from outside. But the game also marks a dawning understanding of the difference between up and down, above and below. Above is the world of adults who look down on the child in every sense, making its little body even smaller with their looks and blows inflicted from on high. Below is the prostrate infant, too uncoordinated even to stand up, let alone defend itself against an onslaught from the heights. For the infant, you might say, the sky is always falling down. And the same could be said of the civilian population under threat of aerial bombardment, which is a point made by Klein's daughter, Melita Schmidberg, in a 1942 article about the emotional effects of air raids. Here, Schmidberg claims that the situation of being attacked from above and being unable to retaliate resembles that of a small child whom an adult can strike from above. So I'll now turn to Taylor's story, A Sad Garden, which also pivots on this ominous alternation between up and down, above and below. The story opens, Sybil is enduring a weekly errand of mercy from her vapid sister-in-law and mousy niece. We soon learn that Sybil has lost everything, husband and son, presumably to the war. But she's failed to display conventional signs of grief, a bit like Camus' contemporary novel, L'Étranger. And this has very much got on the nerves of her relatives. Her sadness seems to be displaced onto her autumnal garden, where the trees groan with rotten fruit, and her dead son's initials have been carved on every surface, haunting them. She had smacked him for that, we're told, for always cutting his name into other people's property, had taken away his chisel. When she did that, he had stared at her in hatred, wild, beautiful, a stain on his mouth from the blackberries or some purple fruit, and a stain of anger on his cheeks. Unlike her wild son, Adam, with his carnal mouth and vandalizing signature, Sybil's niece, Audrey, is a goody-goody who likes school and never plays truant. When Sybil urges her to play on the swing, the seat of which is also carved with Adam's initials, Audrey timidly agrees, primly rocking to and fro while enjoying some, quote, pleasurable guilt in usurping her bolder cousin's place. Exasperated by this sappy behavior, Sybil seizes the seat and hurls it into the treetops, where the birds scatter in panic. That's how Adam used to go, she cries, right up into the leaves. He used to kick the pears down with his feet. This swinging becomes increasingly demonic as Sybil loses consciousness and control, and Audrey's mother has to intervene to save her flying child. In this compulsive ritual, Sybil seems to be playing Fort Da with a vengeance. Just as Freud's grandson throws away his toys in a pantomime of casting out his mother, so Sybil throws away her niece in lieu of her dead son. There you go, she screams with every shove, much as little Ernst compulsively repeats his murderous, oh. Murderous because the expulsion of the substitute, the dropped toy, the catapulted child, expresses a desire to get rid of the original. As Taylor writes, Sybil went on pushing without thinking of Audrey. It's Adam that she's thinking of, and Adam that she's also trying to cast out, to exorcise. Where little Ernst throws his toys onto the ground, though, Sybil pushes the swing into the sky, sending the child flying up again in a wild agony. In reversal of the bombing raids, what goes up in this story, the swing, is deadlier than what falls down. Although the story never explains how Adam and his father died, Sybil's pantomime suggests a reenactment of a bombing raid, but one that she's trying to replay in reverse by launching the missile back into the sky. In this way, the pendulum motion of the swing fulfills the wish to retrieve the lost object together with the contrary wish to get rid of it. Of course, what goes up must come down, except perhaps in Fragonard's famous painting of a pretty lady on a swing, to which I think Taylor is probably alluding. In this painting, the lady's slipper is suspended in a narrow patch of sky, menaced all around by snaky vegetation, while a young man hidden below gazes up her skirt. This Fragonard allusion reinforces the sexual connotations of Taylor's story, the coital rhythm of the swing driven by Sybil's frenzied thrusting. And Taylor also hints that Audrey gains something, as she says, out of this traumatic episode that shatters her carapace of innocence. She sensed that something was terribly wrong, and yet something that was inevitable and not surprising. What is this something? Maybe something like the primal seduction postulated by psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche, in which the child internalizes the enigmatic message of adult sexuality without understanding what it means. In Taylor's story, some such message emerges out of this furious swinging, in the same way that, quote, a question mark of white smoke arises out of the ashes of an autumn bonfire. Although Audrey is evidently terrified, it's unclear if she's afraid of falling or afraid of flying. The story hints that her fear is indistinguishable from excitement. Audrey, with her hair streaming among the branches, flew dizzily away. That pleasurable guilt she feels in hijacking Adam's seat suggests a desire to dethrone her rival, to blot out his initials on the seat, as well as to enjoy his airborne ecstasy. That Adam is the name of the first man who lost his innocence in the sad Garden of Eden adds a biblical resonance, perhaps too obviously, to the story's theme of falling. So to conclude this talk, I'd like to look at Sylvia Townsend Warner's wartime story, Apprentice. This story also focuses on the dynamics of above and below. The story begins by describing a vertiginous topography, an elevated garden topped by a summer house that provides a bomber's eye view of the street below. Perched in this imperious summer house is Lili, a little German girl who's been transplanted to Poland in an all-female household, which we gradually realize is a whorehouse, under the dubious protection of a pedophilic German officer called Major von Kriebeck. Lili's mother, Irma, rejoices that Lili's flaxen hair and eyes testify to an Aryan pedigree, unpolluted by Slavic or Semitic blood. In her summer house, Lili takes pleasure in her elevation as both viewer and dominant outsider over the impoverished passers-by. She takes to dangling food from a string, lowering it and drawing it up again, so that the starving Polish children have to jump for every scrap. But the children annoy her by looking down at the street, searching desperately for every morsel, whereas Lili wants them to look up at their benefactress. At last, they looked up and saw her, Warner writes. Only one child refuses to play this fishing game, a black-haired boy who scolds the other children for jumping at crusts. Lili wonders how tall he is. It's difficult to tell from above, she thinks. Indeed, it's difficult to tell much of anything about people you look down on. The view from above, the bomber's eye view, effaces the humanity of those below. Lili finally overcomes the boy's resistance by lowering a bun so skillfully that it bobs against his face. In a reflex action, the starving child leaps for the food, but Lili whisks it back, too fast for him to catch it. Instead, he falls down motionless. When his tormentor realizes he's dead, she pulls up the dangling bun and eats it herself. Well, the power of this story lies in Warner's authorial restraint. She judges neither Lili nor her obscene household, where racism and cruelty are regarded as virtues necessary to purging the species of degenerates. Lili is as greedy, destructive, paranoid, and sadistic as any Kleinian infant. But she's also innocent, and in fact, it's her innocence that makes her so dangerous. Even her sadistic games originate in pity, not in cruelty. Feeding the starving makes her feel good, though she also wants to keep her beneficiaries in their place, a place below where they must look up at her and look up to her. In Warner's story, as in Blake's poem, The Human Abstract, pity and tyranny go hand in hand. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. I think the play of up and down, above and below is interesting in this painting as well. By emphasizing these dynamics of above and below, Warner implies that Lili's depravity is structural, not personal. The view from above dehumanizes. As the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas insists, responsibility for the other begins with the face-to-face encounter, an encounter that can only take place on an equal level. As we've seen, both these stories emphasize the opposition between above and below. I think it's also worth noting that both involve the death of little boys and the ascendancy of little girls. In both, girls survive at the expense of boys, conniving in the disappearance of their rivals. In A Sad Garden, Audrey usurps Adam's seat, her buttocks rudely blotting out his signature. Indeed, it's tempting to interpret her enthronement and elevation as an assertion of feminine authority and authorship over the masculine inscriptions of the past. In Apprentice, the nameless boy becomes the sacrificial victim of the girl. She murders him in fantasy, if not in fact. Also conspicuously absent are the fathers of these children. Adam and his father seem to have been killed in one fell swoop, while Audrey's father never appears, and Lili's father is a mere hypothesis. From one perspective, this dearth of men reflects the conditions of the home front, dominated by women in the absence of men. This absence may also have contributed to the matricentrism of wartime psychoanalysis, with its exclusive focus on the mother-child dyad, where fathers are effectively cast out of the theory of child development. The prevalence of little girls in both these stories may also be a symptom of survivor's guilt, especially because these girls collude in the extermination of the other sex. Warner, whose schoolmaster father died of grief in World War I, devastated by the deaths of the young men he taught at Harrow, may have seen something of herself in Lili's vengeance. Taylor, who published her first novel in the last year of World War II, may have wondered if her writing thrived on carnage. Such autobiographical speculations can't be proved, but they point to connections between aggression, creativity, and matricentrism that call for further exploration in wartime psychoanalysis, as well as in the fiction of this period. So with that open ending, I end.